Hello, my name is Josh Halford, and this is my Symposium paper entitled An Offset to Immorality, Lessons Learned by Manchester Museum regarding the ownership of heritage and concerns about unconditional repatriation in response to public pressure. Give me a second. Thank you. In November of 2019, Manchester Museum became the first British institution of its kind to unconditionally repatriate secret sacred material to Aboriginal communities in Western Australia. The publicised handover ceremony held at Australia House reinvigorated the decades-long arguments surrounding unconditional repatriation. This paper intends to summarise the sector's concerns against the rising call for repatriation, the lessons to be learned from Manchester Museum's approach to process and the motivation behind their work directly with source communities, and draw criticism against institutions considering repatriation in response to public pressure for, as this paper posits, self-serving reasons rather than to build international bridges. The repatriation of cultural heritage through the return of objects to their place of origin is irrefutably recognised as a complex international issue for the heritage sector, a prevailing hangover shared by all imperialist nations and their former colonies. Cultural repatriation encompasses a vast range of ethical, legal, political and historical factors, in addition to impassioned, emotionally driven arguments tainted by historical preconceptions. The rising notion of morally reputable repatriation brings with it a scrutable lens under which the multifaceted value of these cultural artefacts are investigated and interpreted to either acclaim or criticise the history of both their origin and the circumstances that led to their current state, in order to justify that objects remain or return. Mundane cultural objects become elevated and anthropomorphized after calls arise for their repatriation, their intangible cultural value heralded as morally integral to their worth, but in a form that is arguably unquantifiable nor translatable. On occasion, these debates capture the public's interest, especially for high-profile artefacts and institutions capable of achieving international media attention for their iconic image, accompanying legacy, and source of national pride. As much as both the general public and professional opinions have turned sympathetic towards the notion of repatriation, it is possible to perceive such behaviour as potentially dangerous and backwardly minded, done in service solely in consideration of an organisation's public image against spikes of highly publicised moral outrage. Positive modern societal developments, an increasing blend of diverse cultures and the emergence of multicultural nostalgia can be further encouraged by shared artefacts which greatly exemplify multinational significance rather than solely that of a single nation. The notion, if taken to its fullest, is international repatriation threatens the purpose of progressive museums as cultural encyclopedias, institutions with collections so radically diverse and demonstrative of multiple cultures at once, whether the artefacts are exhibited or otherwise. Since the 1980s, the rise of economic globalization has ushered in a resurgence of collective pride and nationalism globally, coinciding with fresh voices reclaiming ownership of heritage that raises complications for cosmopolitan museums and the diversity of their offerings therein. This has sparked debate into the future form and purpose of museums. Should museums strive to be reflections of total history and of blended modern cultural heritage? Can cultural property ever be realised as an equal collective human legacy, with artefacts belonging to humankind rather than to single nations and specific peoples? This paper urges for a mutually beneficial, internationalist approach with regards to museums considering unconditional repatriation. Instead, it supports the enabling and sustaining of cooperation globally to help ease away from the worst-case scenario, a worldwide resurgence of cultural stereotyping and the possibility of modern Orientalism based on ill-informed, nay wilfully ignorant, misunderstandings of foreign cultures and their histories. This paper intends to demonstrate the concern that the years-learned lessons of Manchester Museum's recent repatriation efforts, derived from decades spent developing a more nuanced understanding of ownership and shared past, are becoming appropriated by non-specialist organisations in the pursuit of repatriation for repatriation's sake and in response to public pressure. On Friday, the 22nd of November 2019, a delegation of traditional owners from the Gangalida Gawara Nation and representatives from the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, Thesis, met with officials from Manchester Museum to signify the unconditional return of 18 culturally significant items to various Aboriginal peoples native to Western Australia. The event signified the beginning of reconciliation, with a total of 43 artefacts returning to their original owners after almost a century of the objects gathering dust in storage at Manchester Museum. These objects from Manchester represented a minuscule proportion of the 100,000 artefacts identified by Thesis, held in collections across the globe. but signalled the start of a wider campaign intended to secure the further return of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage from overseas in coincidence with the 250th anniversary of James Cook's first voyage. For Manchester Museum, this was significant as the institution's first return of secret sacred material after almost 2 decades of actively returning ancestral remains back to their traditional custodians, an opportunity to pioneer the archetypal method of repatriating such sensitive material. This is likely in reference specifically to a chiringa, a small carved stone object returned amongst the other ceremonial artefacts, believed to embody the spiritual double of a relative or ancestor, and considered to be as much representative of the deceased ancestor as their physical remains. The handover ceremony itself was broadcast from Australia House via Periscope, in attendance of multiple media outlets and in excess of 3,800 viewers online. Mangubadi Jariyana, one of the traditional owners, spoke at the event of healing and reconciliation. Locked deep within these items, is our law, our histories, our traditions, and our stories, making clear his intent to revitalise his culture's traditions by disseminating the importance of these returning ceremonial artefacts to young members of his community. Esme Ward, director and spearhead of Manchester Museum's repatriation efforts, placed emphasis on the inclusiveness of this action, stating that the museum's work with Thesis would promote understanding between cultures, offering opportunities to learn together and build new relationships for the future, strengthen trust with source communities globally, work collaboratively, and encourage open conversations about the future of collections, and critically, take action. Ward would further clarify her position on repatriation in an open letter, firmly stipulating that the return of objects to former colonies was in no sense denying Britain's history, nor decontextualising museums as was widely criticised. The issue to Ward fell with traditional museums defending themselves as custodians of total historic knowledge, yet were and are empirically unable to understand cultural significance, as it is spiritual and embodied as opposed to observed or accountable. The 43 secret sacred ceremonial objects being returned by Manchester Museum rightfully belonged to the Aboriginal communities they had been taken from in the 1920s. In the case of the chiringa, it was essentially the equivalent of holding a loved one against their will, thousands of miles from their family, forever crying for his home, a prisoner of European museums. Museums should be seeking to embrace, not run from, the insight and fresh perspectives which can come from outreach into these source communities. Reconciliation through repatriation in the form demonstrated by Manchester Museum could be a great opportunity both in respect to the former colonised communities and introspectively to inform understanding of the wider impact of empire and to re-evaluate the purpose of modern museums. The reason for Ward's sudden shift into vehement defence of Manchester Museum's work with Thesis is that in the 18 months prior to the handover ceremony, the notion of cultural repatriation had resurfaced internationally as a highly controversial topic, no longer confined to internal debate. The Savoy report, published in November 2018, injected repatriation into the public consciousness with an unambiguity for contextualising blame for Western acquisition of African property and deep-cut criticism into the self-serving state of traditional museums policy. The sector was left reeling in the wake of rapidly shifting attitudes in favour of unequivocal restitution, outcry from the general public, students, and ethnic minority groups alike. Ultimately, the sentiments expressed in the Savoy report were not new, echoing those propagated by source communities since well before the turn of the 21st century. The Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, TAC, is a non-profit community organisation established in 1973 to provide support and welfare services to Aboriginal communities throughout Tasmania, similar in function, purpose and funding to Thesis. In 2000, the organisation submitted a memorandum to the British government under Tony Blair, with recommendations that the government acknowledge the primary right of ownership for Aboriginal peoples with regards to all forms of their heritage, amend domestic legislation to enable repatriation to proceed, encourage and support museums in the UK to develop constructive policies with regards to repatriation, and finally and crucially, to endorse the principle of unconditional repatriation of all remains and cultural property as required by the Aboriginal people. The document was similarly frank, if not more graphic, with its approach to attributing blame to imperialists and European collectors for crimes committed to Aboriginal people, yet never circulated to the same degree amongst a wider audience as Savoy. Manchester Museum, in the present, had in essence bypassed the nuances of debate by taking action before the impact of the Sars-IV report had faded from conscious memory. The museum's unconditional repatriation of 43 artefacts and the ceremony at Australia House stood proud and defiant as a demonstration of international cooperation and reconciliation reached through understanding of ownership beyond the physical and quantifiable. Ward's call to take action resonated in the moment with museums and institutions across Europe and manifested results incredibly quickly with one of the pillars of British education. Within the same month of the Thesis handover ceremony, the recently elected Master of Jesus College, Cambridge, Sunita Alain, announced the college's decision to repatriate the college's symbolic bronze cockerel Okuko to Nigeria. The cockerel was one of 1,000 bronzes taken from Benin City during the occupation of imperial troops in 1897 and had been bequeathed to Jesus College in 1930 by a former British Army officer. The college's student union had voted in 2016 for the cockerel to be removed from display after pressure from student activists in the Cambridge University Black and Minority Ethnic campaign. Yet Elaine made clear the college was not intending to erase history, but rather the intent was to seek the best way forward as an honest community. The timing of such an announcement so soon after the highly public ceremony by Manchester Museum draws into question these assumptions, especially after no date has since been set nor further plans made in regards to returning the cockerel to Nigeria. The concern here is that the years learned lessons of Manchester Museum's repatriation efforts that were born from understanding nuanced definitions of ownership and shared past are being appropriated in the pursuit of fashion and a positive public image in the face of sudden public outrage. Jesus College's motives for returning the Benin bronze are unquestionably sought in pursuit of rejecting colonialism from the university's campus, regardless of Elaine's statement on the matter. Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, journalist and former president of the Cambridge University Black and Minority Ethnic campaign, made clear in a follow-up article that the decision to repatriate the cockerel was to signal to Black and minority ethnic students that the university recognised and renounced the exploitation, dehumanisation and degradation of their ancestors. Batchelor-Hunt likened the campaign to both Rhodes Must Fall, Decolonise Cambridge, and Glasgow University's payment of £20 million in reparative justice for its historic links to colonialism, drawing in the wider political context of the Labour Party's intention to make the impact of empire a standard part of the curriculum should they come into power. These highly motivated campaigns assume a perspective sympathetic to source communities which demonises the ancestors of modern imperialists. This is despite the majority of students having lived and grown up in the Western world, certainly with regards to education to university level, thus condemning part of their culture rather than learning from it. Manchester Museum accumulated 2 decades worth of experience working alongside source communities from a mutually open-minded and unprejudiced point of view. As such, the monumental impact of returning secret sacred material, such as the Chiringa, is all the more significant for both sides as it was reached from a position of mutual understanding for its true cultural importance. The return of a bronze cockerel, most likely intended solely for decorative purposes, is no equivalent, regardless of the circumstances of its removal. The intent to assign responsibility for past actions is what motivated calls for Jesus College to seek repatriation rather than foresight into a shared international future, formed through an awareness of the past, that undermined Manchester Museum's work with Thesis. To present an analogy, late 2019 also saw heritage and the arts come under public scrutiny from a different moral quandary: corporate sponsorship. BP, the multinational oil and gas company, was compelled to end its sponsorship of the Royal Shakespeare Company at the end of 2019 in response to months of vocal outcry from 16 to 24-year-olds whom the BP's £5 ticket scheme was intended to benefit. It was a significant result for protest groups and environmentalists who condemned BP's impact on the globe, taking the view that the relationship was in essence the RSC turning a blind eye to accepting profits from the worldwide climate crisis in order to offset the oil company's immoral actions. BP's sponsorship of the RSC was merely one of a series of culture projects supported by an excess of £7.5 million investment from BP over the course of 5 years. These include the National Portrait Gallery's annual BP Portrait Award, the Royal Opera House's BP Big Screens, and sponsoring of BP-branded special exhibitions at the British Museum. With the RSC receiving praise in the media for relenting to public pressure, national attention turned to these other projects in expectation of a similar result. This has escalated, especially in the case of the British Museum, with both members of the public and museum staff occupying the site in early February 2020, alongside a BP-branded Trojan horse, calling for the museum's management to instantly sever ties with the oil company. As a public institution, the British Museum owed it to its staff, its visitors, and its future to play a responsible role. If the British Museum were to announce the decision to end its sponsorship agreement with BP, it would likely satiate protest and be heralded as the morally correct decision, just as had occurred with the RSC. The parallel this paper intends to draw is that the ownership of the decision regarding both BP's sponsorship and the repatriation of Jesus College's bronze cockerel lay with concerns over the public protesting and not with the issues themselves, as was the case with Manchester Museum. Repatriation should not represent a short-term fix to quell public outcry, but the formation of international bridges and a process of ongoing interaction and support. Manchester Museum's work with source communities through Thesis and other partners represented the culmination of decades' work identifying, understanding, and reconciling a shared history. The return of objects to the Gangalida Gowara Nation in 2019 was not done as an offset to immorality, but as continuation of the very human ability to sympathise with and understand the lives and legacies of all peoples through artefacts symbolic of a rich, multifaceted heritage. Jesus College intends to remove itself from any association with colonialism, and so it assumes a contrary perspective to imperialism, subsequently attempting to deny its past to save face, rather than accepting its part in a wider history and working enlightened into the future. Here lies the issue with considering repatriation as always morally good. The act itself is neutral without knowing the intent of those enacting it. It should be the roles of museums like Manchester, whose extensive experience makes them more than qualified to help facilitate these relationships and foster international understanding, not pressure groups who desire the success of a trending headline. As momentum grows for the return of cultural material to former colonies, this paper urges for an internationalist approach with regards to museums considering unconditional repatriation. This would be following the example of Manchester Museum, engaging with and working alongside source communities to realise their perspective rather than dogmatically assuming it and acting on their behalf. This would be a strong step forward, offering an opportunity for both introspection on empire and the purpose of modern museums, in addition to a fresh appreciation for artefacts with knowledge of their significance in context of their loss, not only the circumstances of their removal. Organisations should, in response to public pressure, seek broader perspectives in order to take ownership of their past in a process beneficial to both themselves and source communities through constructive international cooperation. As Mangubadijari posited at the handover ceremony, when we come together as one, united by our desire to do better, to be better, and to right the wrongs of the past, we start to heal spiritual hurts and the intergenerational trauma that exists today. Thank you for listening, and I apologise for butchering the names of source communities, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium.